housing for our residents and to make Fremont a home for everyone. And we've been in existence for a couple of years, first with the Housing Navigation Center, and now most recently advocating on the issue of safe parking for unhoused in RVs and a number of other issues that are very, very timely. And part of what we do is educational outreach. So I encourage you to look at our website if you don't know about it already at fremontforeveryone.com, and it's FOReveryone.com for our upcoming events. And at this time, I'd like to introduce our panel. We have invited Abode Services, which is a local nonprofit based in Fremont. It's become a regional and national leader in addressing homelessness and the causes for it and the remedies for it. We have two guest speakers, and I'm going to introduce them. But before I do, I want to let you know generally what the format is. We're going to be having a video presentation, and after the video presentation, we're going to be having a panel discussion of what we've just seen. And during this time, I encourage you to use the chat box feature in the Zoom, as Vanita will be gathering the questions, and we'll be having a Q&A after the panel discussion. And please, as a courtesy to everyone else, make sure you are on mute, because we're all in this together. And if anybody doesn't have it on mute, we'll be hearing the sounds in the background. So we want to have a very clear ability to hear the presentation this evening. So we have two wonderful leaders from Abode Services that are going to lead our discussion. They in turn, at an appropriate time, are going to be introducing clients of Abode Services to have a real world perspective on the receiving end of the services that they provide. And our two guests this evening are Vivian Wan, who's the Chief Operating Officer. She's responsible for the day-to-day operations of Abode Services. Through close collaboration with directors and community stakeholders, she helps advance Abode's mission by overseeing all programs and securing strategic opportunities to increase the supply of affordable housing options. And we also have Joy Jones, VP of Programs, Region 2. Joy oversees program operations for housing and service programs at Abode Service in Region 2, Santa Clara, Santa Cruz, and San Mateo counties. I used to be on the board for Abode, full disclosure, but they didn't have regions yet. So they've gotten much larger and have regions now. So it's terrific. She's responsible for implementing high quality programs that achieve positive housing, health, and wellness outcomes. Joy is committed to helping participants who face socioeconomic barriers and leveling the playing field for individuals and families, along with comprehensive supporting housing programs in the community. And at this time, I'd like to turn it over to Vivian and to Joy.
Thanks, Dave, and thanks everyone for inviting us today to talk to you, and moreover to actually listen to the video that was actually developed as a training tool for board members, for our staff, but in listening to it, thought it was a good tool to talk about homelessness and really the history of homelessness and where we are now. So we're really excited. I'm a Chief Operating Officer. I've been here for 15 years. I'm a Fremont resident, also this time 15 years, and previously 4 years, so almost 20. So all those who say, oh, it's not like it used to be, I've been part of Fremont for, a couple of decades as well. So I'm a proud resident here. And I also went to high school here, so it goes way back. I'd like to introduce you to Joy, our VP of Services. And yeah, Dave, we had to split up into regions. Quality is important to us, and we just needed more folks to lead. Joy, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Thanks, Vivian. Good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I am Joy Jones, and I'm the Vice President of Programs and Services here at Abode, and grew so large. Now we have Region 1 and Region 2. And I am over Region 2, which would be San Mateo, Santa Clara County, and Santa Cruz is our newest county that we've been working with. I am fairly new to Abode, a year and a couple of months in, actually. And I relocated here from Atlanta, Georgia, where I had lived for about 22, 23 years. And prior to that, my origins are actually the Midwest. Grew up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, went to college in Ohio, and spent part of my life in Michigan. So kind of bounced around. I just kind of follow where good weather is, if you notice that. And we got snow in Atlanta over the weekend. So now I'm in California. So let's see how this goes. But I'm glad to be here, glad to lead a great group, of staff and directors in this work, and glad to spend this time with you. As you know, as I indicated, coming out of Atlanta, civil rights headquarters or capital, I've been watching a lot of the activities that have been going on today. To be able to go to Martin Luther King's birth home, with some frequency has been just a pleasure. To also see some of the civil rights icons who still come into the city has also been a pleasure. So glad to be here and glad that this important evening and time that we can spend together. Thank you. Vivian?
Yeah, and
Okay.
I think that our two residents have joined us. Is that right, Catherine?
Have they joined us, Catherine?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Lori
Okay.
Ann Staples is on.
Okay,
You want
great.
to introduce them, Joy?
Sure. So we have Lorianne and Clifford that I have not had I've met, oh, sorry, and they are residents at City Center. So I hope you can hear me okay. At City Center, one of our newest properties right here in Fremont. I heard Clifford speak a couple weeks ago at our opening for City Center, and I was like, if we ever have another opportunity to have him speak, we should have him speak. And in addition to his partner. So whoever wants to introduce themselves first, I don't see them on screen, but I know that they're here. Lorianne?
I believe I'm here.
You're here.
I can't see myself.
Oh, you can't.
We
Well,
can
go
hear
ahead.
you.
Go ahead.
Okay.
We can hear you.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for having us.
Oh, great. Lorianne, is Clifford there with you?
He's not available right now. He's still at work.
Oh, he's still at work. Okay, great. All right. And then Lorianne, how long have you been living at City Center?
We've been here since October 26th.
Okay, great. Okay, all right. So we're gonna watch a video and then have some more discussion, I guess.
Okay.
Great. And are we passing it back to you, Dave, for the video?
No, we're passing it right back. It's ping pong. We're going to pass it to you, and I don't know who's got control of the video. So do you want to describe how you put, this is Abode University, Vivian. Do you want to describe the video and then we'll start it?
Sure. And Catherine, do you have the video queued up?
I do. Let me,
Great, perfect.
yeah, let me just make sure. I got
So, so again, can everyone see and soon to be here?
Yes.
Great. So again, this is a video. It's about 40 minutes. If, and I do hope that you stick around for the whole thing. It sort of, it walks you through the causes of homelessness, and I don't know if I can take liberty, Dave, but this is a great group of folks who really, believe in housing for everyone. So I suppose that you have some ideas of the causes of homelessness, and you're not the normal person, maybe, the normal neighbor that we hear from often. But, can we have folks shout out some reasons that homelessness exists in our society today? Any guesses? Not guesses. You guys know what you're talking about. Annie, I see you raising your hand. Oh, folks are so polite here.
Housing costs are very high. Usually rent is too high.
Housing stock. That's right. Catherine?
I was going to say basically the same thing. My spouse and I, as we aged and disabilities set in, our income lowered while housing costs kept rising, and we ended up homeless for a period of time because of that. And then, of course, there's not enough resources to help people who are in that kind of a situation. So, yeah.
Yep, you got it. Kate, I did see a Kate pop up, but maybe took their hand down.
Well, basically the same thing. The income inequality, the
Income.
not providing a living wage. A person can be working full time and definitely not be able to afford rent or mortgage in the San Francisco Bay Area. It's just exorbitantly expensive.
Absolutely.
So
So
I'm
that,
not going to volunteer a reason. I'm just going to say I've watched it, and although I thought I was well versed in it, I learned a lot. So I think this will be new information for most of us, even if we think we know what the causes are.
well, great. Well, I really hope that you get a lot from it. I please use the chat in the middle of it, and after we'll have an opportunity to have a great dialogue. I'll also tell you a little bit more about Abode's impact. So we'll talk more about what we're doing locally and regionally. But with no further ado, it's about 40 minutes. So, eat your dinner, go off screen, but watch the video at the same time. Great. Want to play it? Can folks hear it? I don't think we can hear it.
Can you make it more full screen?
According to the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development's 2020 Annual Progress Assessment Report, on a single night in 2020.
Can you all hear that very well?
It's a little too faint and gravelly.
Yeah, I can't hear very well. Get here. How do we respond?
I don't know if I can make it louder.
We're going to build understanding of the causes of homelessness and the policies that have created the current crisis.
I can't make it louder. Vivian, do you want me to stop and we'll try it
Sure.
again?
Let me, I can try.
Okay.
Sorry about this, guys. Hey, Dave, I know you can carry a conversation for a little while, so why don't you put something out while I put this up?
Well, very good. While I'm here, I want to introduce one of the things that's happened for Fremont for Everyone since we've had some events last year is we've had our own bylaws and we've elected our leadership team, and I wanted to introduce others. This is very much a collaborative effort. On our leadership team there this evening as we have Aaron Eckhouse from California YIMBY, Wave Hayes Share, an architect and a designer. Lisa Dans has been very involved from District 3 too. I know that's wonderful. We have an overabundance of people from downtown Fremont, which is wonderful. Vanita Verma is here from our leadership team. Catherine Ruby we have here. And who am I missing? Paul Webster is here, also involved in the Lonely Renegades. So he's
Annie.
And then Annie
Also me.
and Annie
Hi.
Caruso. There we go, Annie. and so that is our wonderful leadership team, and you'll see.
Me too.
And then Marie Hughes. Hello, Marie. Thank you. Who's our communications liaison. So the newsletters and our social media posts are courtesy of Marie. So have I done enough filler? Are we have it ready for the movie?
Keep going. I'm trying to change my audio so that you'll be able to hear it.
Very
All right.
good.
David,
So-
if I may, filler idea, but it's important. Have we already talked about what's coming up at council tomorrow?
Who's speaking? I'm sorry.
It's Annie.
Go ahead, Annie.
Cool. Yeah, so I don't know all of the ins and out policy details of this. I think Hayes is on and they may know more, but long story short, we or the city of Fremont is considering purchasing a Motel 6 in Warm Springs and turning it into permanent supportive housing. And they can get some money from the state to do this if they apply by, I believe, the 31st of this month. They get an extra 1.5 million in incentive funding. So it's really important that this happens now so our city has as much funding as possible to have systemic, permanent, supportive housing instead of having a bunch of people on the streets with no resources. So tomorrow night, the city council in Fremont is considering this agenda item. And some of us are already planning to either call in or write comments to the city council, like emails or both. If this sounds like something that you want to do, and I hope that anybody who is available and can do it does, just put in the chat that you're interested. We have a messenger chat started, and I can add you if you're on Facebook so we can organize. We also have a talking points doc as per Hayes. Thank you so much for that. And if you have anything else to add, I think people would be more than happy to hear what you have to say.
Thank you, Annie. The other thing that is developed, Hayes, maybe you can fill us in on this. We've been in touch with Suzanne Schenfeld from the city of Fremont, and we now finally have 4 participating organizations for our RV parking. It's very much on a pilot scale. This is overnight RV parking, sadly for only 15 RVs at a time at 4 various locations in Fremont. It is a start, but our advocacy for the safe parking strategy has really been to advocate for both level 2 and level 3 of the strategy, which is to provide for city supported services and ideally a location that the city leases or owns to have a more systemic approach to the growing RV population. So we're concerned particularly with the lifting, although Alameda County still has a moratorium on evictions for residential tenants. It stands alone that way. I don't know if there's any recent efforts to rescind that, but as long as the moratorium is in place and as long as we have a local emergency in place at the county level, it freezes the problem. But once that gets lifted, perhaps after Omicron, we anticipate a flood of people that are going to be dislocated from their residential tenancies, and it's going to balloon as a crisis. So Hayes, did you want to add anything to the RV program that you've learned about?
I'll let the video go, and maybe at the very end I'll add a quick update. I don't want to interrupt this.
I didn't want to step over the video. Are we ready to launch?
We're gonna give it a go, Dave. So
All right,
are folks ready?
According to the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development's 2020 Annual Homeless Assessment Report, on a single night in 2020, roughly 580,000 people were experiencing homelessness in the United States. How did we get here? How do we respond? In this training, we are going to build understanding of the causes of homelessness and the policies that have created the current crisis, build empathy for those experiencing homelessness, and continue to stay connected to Abode's mission. These learning objectives are crucial to our work at Abode. That's because service providers on the front lines of the issue are often most focused on how to help people who are either facing or experiencing homelessness, how to connect them to the housing, services, and other resources that will end their homelessness for good. We often think about what we do, not why we do it or how we got here. This presentation picks up those questions. Specifically, why are so many people experiencing homelessness? Why does this problem seem to be getting worse, despite all of the hard work that we are doing? What are examples of progress and success? What can be done beyond what we are already doing? Throughout our journey today, you'll hear from various voices at Abode. We're also thankful to SHM Consulting, who created and compiled the research that we'll present today. We start by looking backward and reviewing a brief history of homelessness. American homelessness is a relatively new phenomenon. Aside from a brief period during the Great Depression, homelessness simply did not occur in the United States in any ongoing, large-scale manner until around the 1980s. We often think about homelessness as this intractable, ahistorical feature of the urban landscape, but it is not. It was not always this way. Rather, it emerged in the 1980s in response to a very specific set of policy and socioeconomic shifts. First, let's go back and look at what happened starting in the 1930s. The first time that homelessness appeared as a massive and widespread problem was during the Great Depression. Between 1929 and the early 1930s, when the stock market and broader American economy collapsed, the unemployment rate soared to 25% as millions of Americans lost their jobs. The most vulnerable among them lost their homes as well, and an estimated 2 million people were suddenly unsheltered. This gave rise to hundreds of encampments across the US, which were often referred to as Hoovervilles, a direct political critique of the Hoover administration, who many people blamed for the crisis and lack of response. What happened to the Hoovervilles and all of the Americans who were living on the streets during this time? Two closely related events. First, Franklin D. Roosevelt replaced Hoover as the next president and ushered in the New Deal, a set of sweeping policy reforms and assistance programs. The New Deal included works programs, financial assistance, financial reforms, and some of the nation's first public housing, all of which began to collectively lift Americans out of the poverty of the Depression. Second, the economy rebounded at the start of World War II with a flood of new manufacturing jobs, effectively reducing the unemployment rate to less than 10% by 1941, then into the low single digits a few years later. And just like that, the homelessness of the Great Depression mostly disappeared. American homelessness did not reappear at a significant scale until the 1980s. As with the Great Depression, it emerged in direct response to a very specific set of policy and socioeconomic shifts that began in the 1970s. However, unlike during the Great Depression, it was never met with a modern New Deal. As a result, what may have been a tragic but short-lived period of people living on the streets in destitution has instead become a massive and seemingly intractable problem, something that we often think about as an ahistorical and inevitable feature of our urban landscape. In addition, these shifts had disproportionately negative implications for people of color. So what exactly were those policy and socioeconomic shifts? First, there was job loss and wage stagnation. Starting in the 1960s, the American economy began to shift away from industrial production. Between 1970 and 2005, this led to the loss of 5 million manufacturing jobs and as many as 25 million other associated jobs. Many of these had been very coveted jobs with comparably high wages, good benefits, and in many cases, pensions. And they were often held by people without high school or college educations. These jobs were largely replaced by more flexible, lower paid jobs with fewer protections, or not replaced at all. This created a new vulnerability for people who did not have a comparable place in a newly globalizing economy. Deindustrialization was devastating for many American workers, but disproportionately so for Black communities. Manufacturing job losses were concentrated in cities like Detroit, Chicago, and St. Louis, where Black people comprised a sizable portion of the manufacturing workforce. And when those jobs disappeared, the barriers faced by Black people, particularly those who did not have college degrees, when seeking comparable positions, were much greater than those faced by their white counterparts due to widespread discrimination and other factors. In addition to job losses, wages during this time were stagnating or falling. Between 1970 and 1993, real hourly wages fell for all workers except those at the highest percentiles. At the lowest percentiles, particularly among those in the bottom 20% of earners, where those wages were most critically needed, the wage losses were the steepest. That was the first shift. More and more American workers were losing their jobs and or seeing significant decreases in what they were earning. The second shift was the loss of affordable housing. Between 1970 and 1990, in part because of the transforming economy, the number of low-wage renter households increased by almost 5 million. However, the number of units affordable to them was in steep decline. More specifically, close to 1 million affordable rental units were lost across the United States between 1970 and 1993, including many single-room occupancy or SRO units in places like San Francisco, New York, and Seattle, where they were demolished or converted to market rate in the name of revitalization and redevelopment. While these naturally affordable units were disappearing, there was a corresponding loss in the number of publicly subsidized affordable housing units, in the form of a massive and systematic federal disinvestment from housing. Between 1976 and 2002, the federal budget for housing programs for low-income renters plummeted by almost 60%, from over $80 billion to less than $35 billion. In 1976, the Section 8 program alone went from funding 517,000 vouchers to fewer than 150,000. This federal abandonment of housing includes the demolition of roughly 300,000 units of public housing across the U.S. between 1970 and 1990, many of which were less than 30 years old. Only 1 in 6 of these units was ever replaced, and of those, the affordability was often not as deep, which meant that fewer of the lowest income households could live there. That was the second shift. Fewer and fewer low-income households could afford housing, and there was much less affordable housing to go around.
This too had profound racial implications. When the federal government disinvested from funding affordable housing and tore down public housing, and when SROs and other low-cost housing options were demolished and/or gentrified through urban renewal, the affordable housing that was lost was occupied disproportionately by people of color. And this was after and alongside decades of discriminatory housing practices, like redlining, suburbanization, racially restrictive covenants, and such, that had already produced deeply segregated neighborhoods that excluded people of color entirely. As this was happening, at the precise time when a social safety net was critically needed, it was disintegrating. More specifically, between 1972 and 1994, the real value of welfare benefits, aid to families with dependent children, or AFDC, declined by almost half, from $728 to $395 per month in 1994 dollars. If you did not have a job, and many of the poorest Americans were out of work at this time, and this was your only income, it became harder and harder to make ends meet. That was the third shift. While welfare had never been particularly generous, it was shrinking to the point where it no longer served as a safety net. As these processes started to pile on, they created a devastating new vulnerability for the lowest income households. Another process unfolding at this time was deinstitutionalization. Earlier in the 20th century, mostly in the 1960s and 1970s, state mental health institutions were being shut down. These institutions were widely maligned, and the process of closing them was initially seen as a positive development that would improve care. The institutions were meant to be replaced with community-based systems of mental health care in which people with serious mental health disabilities could receive treatment and services while living more independently in their communities and/or with their families, instead of heavily medicated in a locked, often isolated facility. But funding for the community care system did not materialize at the scale needed, and the families and communities to which the people who had been institutionalized were released were rarely equipped to assume that role. What happened instead was that many of the 500,000 people who left these institutions thus never stabilized in the places to which they'd been released, nor were they successfully connected to care. Many made their way into SROs, halfway houses, and other less ideal, more precarious living situations instead. And, as those units began to disappear, along with the disintegrating safety net of welfare and disability benefits, many found themselves without any housing options at all. And, for too many, this turned into a cycle of homelessness, incarceration, and further trauma. The fallout from deinstitutionalization not only meant that thousands more people were at risk of homelessness, it also cemented the relationship between mental illness and homelessness in the minds of the American public. But it is important to frame this carefully. The cause of homelessness at this time was not mental illness. The cause of homelessness was the dissolution of a flawed mental health system. And sadly for many, the post-institutional experience of homelessness and its pursuant traumas intensified and compounded their mental illness. When taken together, these four shifts, the loss of wages and deindustrialization, the loss of affordable housing, the dissolution of the social safety net, and deinstitutionalization, overlapped and interacted in the 1980s to produce, for the first time, a sizable and growing number of people who literally had no housing and no options, who were living and dying on the streets.
From the emergency response to the rise of housing first. The initial response to homelessness was crafted as an emergency response, built on the premise that this was a short-term crisis. The emphasis was thus emergency interventions, food, clothing, shelter, and other things that were intended to tie people over and provide crisis assistance until people got back on their feet. There was very little federal assistance to address homelessness. Most resources came from local government and charitable organizations. It was a threadbare safety net at best, based on the flawed assumption that this was a temporary crisis. Notably absent from the initial response was housing, both because there were very few resources devoted to the problem and because the problem, despite the many structural forces driving it, was seen in many cases as a short-term crisis, like a natural disaster or an individual problem attributable to bad decisions and mental illness. By the late 1980s, the problem had not gone away. It had deepened. And many researchers and advocates pointed to the need for a more substantive response that would provide a deeper and longer-term level of assistance. By 1989, Congress passed the McKinney-Vento Act, which provided about $350 million to create the first federally funded non-emergency responses, specifically for those experiencing homelessness. It included funding for street outreach, shelters, case management, supportive services, and transitional and permanent housing. It was based upon the concept of a continuum of care, where someone would start in emergency shelter, stabilize, then move on to transitional housing, where they would demonstrate their readiness for housing by going through training programs and treatment and such. Then, they would graduate to permanent housing. According to HUD's initial assessment, these programs were quite successful for the people who they served, many of whom were able to move on to permanent housing in some form. Indeed, many of the programs initially funded by the McKinney-Vento resources are still in operation today. Nonetheless, during this time, the problem of homelessness continued to intensify. Part of this was that the demand for help continued to outstrip the supply, and only a fraction of those experiencing homelessness could get assistance. But part of this was the approach. These programs did not work for everyone. For many people, it was hard to get into them. Depending upon the program, there could be different wait lists for different programs, confusing and conflicting eligibility requirements, complex applications that required extensive documentation, and long wait times. Some of them required that you have good credit or no history of eviction or incarceration, or good references. It could also be hard to stay in them. Again, depending on the program, there might be curfews, no guest policies, mandated service participation or treatment, drug tests, and strict rules about allowable activities. While these programs offered structure and support for some people, for others they were either impossible or intolerable. By the mid-1990s, researchers and advocates began to notice that there was a growing percentage of those experiencing homelessness that was not thriving or succeeding in some of these programs, and that, in most cases, the people who were not thriving were those whose service needs were the greatest. Many of them had severe mental illness that had been compounded by years on the streets. Others had serious substance use disorders and could not get into or stay in housing programs that required abstinence. Seen as not ready for housing, faced with numerous insurmountable barriers and having failed in a few programs that they did attempt, many of these individuals were largely disconnected from care, in terrible health, and living unsheltered on the streets. One mental health treatment center, Pathways in New York City, grew really frustrated with how many of their patients experiencing homelessness were struggling with getting housing. What they observed was that, without housing, it was really hard for people with mental illness to meaningfully engage in treatment. Their lives consisted of surviving, staying dry, finding food, keeping track of their belongings, looking for places to stay, and navigating the many traumas and difficulties of life on the streets. It was simply impossible to prioritize mental health over survival. When the folks at Pathways asked their clients what they wanted and needed most, they always said the same thing: housing. So rather than working to get them housing ready, Pathways started to just place people directly into housing. They removed the strict requirements. They did not mandate participation in treatment. They did not require that they abstain from substance use or maintain employment. They required them to adhere to the requirements of their lease and pay a modest and affordable portion of their income toward the rent. Then Pathways paid the remainder of the rent and made a range of other services available to them on a voluntary basis. This approach sound familiar to you? And the results were remarkable. People succeeded in housing, even people with serious mental illness who before this had not been considered housing ready were showing that they had been ready all along. Success rates, meaning ongoing housing stability, range from 90 to 95%, and engagement in treatment and services increased once people were housed. Pathways demonstrated what now seems obvious. Housing is the foundation for everything else, and until you have safe, stable housing, it is much harder to do anything else. Engage in treatment, find a job, reunify with family, and more. And while this is true for everyone, it is particularly salient for those experiencing chronic homelessness. People with long histories of homelessness, disability, and other significant barriers to housing, many of whom had largely given up hope on the prospect of ever succeeding in housing again. The success of the Housing First model, especially with those experiencing chronic homelessness, was particularly compelling for many providers, funders, local governments, and other stakeholders, because many of them were becoming increasingly focused on exactly that population around the same time. There were two reasons for this. First, as homelessness had grown so much over the years, those experiencing chronic homelessness represented the toughest cases, which other programs had not successfully housed. They were increasingly visible on the streets, in encampments, and in other public spaces. Second, due largely to untreated mental health, substance use, and medical conditions, they frequently used costly emergency services, like emergency rooms, jails, psychiatric emergency rooms, and other resources. They were cycling in and out of services at significant cost to local governments. Cities and counties were spending millions of dollars on services for people that did not end their homelessness or improve their well-being in any long-term way. Numerous studies began to show that, among those experiencing chronic homelessness, roughly 10% of them accounted for 60 to 80% of emergency service utilization. Housing First programs demonstrated that once those experiencing chronic homelessness were housed, they were not only successful and stable in housing, but their utilization of emergency services typically declined significantly. As such, the Housing First approach has transformed the field. It is now standard practice required by most funders, both because of its success rate and its ability to serve people who, before this, struggled to access care. Despite these improvements, there were still issues within the homeless system of care. Namely, it was still difficult to navigate. With lots of different entry points and providers, people had to knock on 1,000,000 doors just to find one path to housing. Because of that, even with the Housing First approach, people with the greatest barriers were least likely to get help, while those with the fewest barriers were most likely to access housing. Along those lines, the system wasn't always rational or fair. With so many doors to services, two people with similar needs may end up with two very different types of help. This is where coordinated entry started. Mandated by HUD, coordinated entry is intended to address these issues and make the system fairer and easier to navigate. It does this by reconfiguring access to the system in two ways. First, all of a community's housing resources are accessed through one central channel, which eliminates all other side and back doors to services. Everyone goes through the same door. Second, all of the people seeking assistance are assessed according to their level of need and connected to resources that best match those needs. So the most vulnerable people receive the most intensive services, and the less vulnerable people receive lighter touch services. In a perfect world, then, coordinated entry makes the homeless system of care rational, fair, and easier to navigate. In actuality, the success of coordinated entry is often hindered by the lack of resources available to those seeking help. We will discuss that next by looking at where we are now.
Where we are now. So, in summary, since homelessness first emerged in the 1980s, we have introduced a dedicated system of care for people experiencing homelessness, embraced and implemented best practices that have led to greater success within those programs, introduced coordinated entry, which enables communities to distribute their resources for ending homelessness more fairly, efficiently, and consistently. With these innovations and investments, and with all of our hard work, why does it look and feel like the problem isn't getting any better and may be getting worse? Because it is, in many senses, getting worse. Despite the concerted efforts of many advocates, service providers, local government agencies, and other stakeholders, the problem is intensifying. After several years of gradual reductions between 2007 and 2017, homelessness has begun to increase nationally by about 2 to 3% per year. And California is unquestionably the epicenter. The number of people experiencing homelessness in California grew by more than 10,000 between 2019 and 2020, an increase that accounted for 80% of the national increase of 12,000, and the count took place before the pandemic. Despite all the work we do to get people out of homelessness, there is very little we do as a society to prevent people from experiencing homelessness in the first place. That front door to homelessness, which cracked open for the first time 40 years ago, remains quite open today. More specifically, the loss of well-paying jobs for people who do not have a college degree continues, and the lowest income households have continued to fall behind in terms of wages. When you adjust for inflation, most people make less today than they would have 40 years ago. And jobs are increasingly flexible, meaning the lowest paid workers are more likely to lose their jobs, not have benefits, and or have their hours or wages reduced. In other words, American workers are even more vulnerable than they were in the 1980s. Affordable housing is even more scarce than it was in the 1980s. Today, there is just one affordable housing unit for every 4 households that need it, which means that 3 of 4 low-income households is paying more for their housing than they can afford. And waitlists for public housing and Section 8 vouchers can be 5 to 8 years long, depending on where you live. In California alone, the shortage of affordable rental units in 2021 is estimated by the Low Income Housing Coalition as close to 1 million units. The safety net has continued to fray since the 1980s. Not only has the value of welfare benefits continued to decline, but welfare reform and other laws have made it so that those programs serve even fewer people due to term limits, workfare, and other restrictions. There is a growing number of families who cannot access these benefits at all, despite living well below the poverty line. Another factor has contributed since the 1980s, the shift toward mass incarceration in the United States. Between 1980 and 1990, due to harsher sentencing laws and the war on drugs, the American prison population doubled. And many of the laws that made people more likely to be incarcerated also made it increasingly difficult to survive upon release. There were new restrictions on where formerly incarcerated people could live and work. There were stricter terms of community supervision, which added additional restrictions on where people could live and who they could spend time with. Left largely to fend for themselves in a hostile reentry climate, many formerly incarcerated people started to exit prison and jail directly into homelessness, and into protracted cycles of incarceration and homelessness. We cannot talk about mass incarceration without talking about race. When the U.S. moved toward mass incarceration, those policies reflected deep racial biases, with Black people incarcerated at rates 5 times that of white people, and in certain states 10 to 12 times that rate, often with longer sentences and harsher terms of probation and parole. The severity of racism in the American system of mass incarceration led one scholar to describe it as the new Jim Crow. The racial disparities within each of these contributing factors thus show themselves plainly in contemporary homelessness. Black people constitute 11% of the Alameda County population, but 47% of those experiencing homelessness. The Latinx population makes up 27% of the Santa Clara County population, but 43% of those experiencing homelessness. Homelessness reflects policy failures in housing, labor, welfare, criminal justice, and health, failures that both reflect and perpetuate racial disparities. As a result, today, the impact of homelessness is borne disproportionately by people of color. Returning to the question of why we cannot seem to make a dent in homelessness, in the midst of these ongoing shifts, there are simply not enough resources to stem the tide. As we just covered, the federal government disinvested from affordable housing starting in the 1970s and did not begin to reinvest until recently, and not nearly at the scale needed. As we mentioned earlier, between 1970 and 2002, the disinvestment was equal to roughly $45 billion per year, a 60% reduction of annual outlays. This was almost $50 billion per year in funding that supported deeply affordable housing, which kept millions of very low-income households from experiencing homelessness. When the federal government finally decided to reinvest in homeless programs with the first McKinney-Vento Act in 1989, that initial reinvestment was $350 million, which increased to $1.4 billion or so in the mid-late 90s, then up to $2 billion more recently. In other words, we replaced $45 billion in cuts to deeply affordable permanent housing with less than $2 billion in homelessness assistance. Then we wonder why there isn't enough to go around. In recent years, other federal resources have become available, including funding for veterans, modest increases in voucher funding, and other programs. And the state of California has begun to invest a greater number of housing resources. But that loss of funding, sustained over 40 years, is a massive deficit to overcome. What that means for us is that there is not enough to go around. In a perfect world with a fully funded system and all the programs that we have developed, you'd have the more vulnerable people being housed first, but the other people on the list would be housed too. It might take a bit longer, and they might get a bit less, but the overall effect would be a more fair and mostly rational means of distributing resources where everyone gets something along the lines of what they need. But with a fraction of the resources we need, most coordinated entry systems can only serve the people who are most vulnerable, leaving many people without any assistance at all. That is why it sometimes feels like we are rowing against a current. For every success, there are so many people that still need help. And visible in our work are the racial disparities and inequities that are embedded in homelessness.
This big picture can be discouraging, but the point here is not to despair. It should help us understand the work we are doing. It should help us understand why it feels so hard sometimes. But it should also yield some bright spots. First, if we return again to history, we have ended homelessness before. 2 million Americans experienced homelessness during the Great Depression, but that problem largely disappeared within 10 years with the help of the New Deal and a booming economy. It is entirely possible for us to make similar change today, to harness the growth of the American economy to benefit more people, and to lift people out of poverty with a modern version of the New Deal. Along those lines, American homelessness, as we know it, is new. 40 years ago, virtually no one experienced homelessness. This is something that has come about in our lifetime. Change can work both ways, and it can work quickly. We can advocate and demand for change even while we do our best in a flawed system. A better world is possible. Also, help is on the way. For the first time, local and state resources are starting to make up that huge gap in resources, and new investments in housing and other upstream interventions promise to staunch the flow in years to come. In March 2021, the American Recovery Plan Act, or ARPA, for COVID relief passed, and in that bill alone, there is more than $30 billion in housing and homeless funding, plus extended unemployment benefits, child tax credits for families, one-time financial assistance, funding for students experiencing homelessness, $1 billion in additional temporary assistance for needy families and welfare funding, significant expansions to the Affordable Care Act, and rural housing programs, all of which will lift many individuals and households out of poverty, get them into housing, connect them to healthcare, and otherwise address many contributing factors. Even more, another $350 billion in funding is now available for states and cities, some portion of which will also go toward homelessness assistance. This is an unprecedented opportunity to move the needle on homelessness, and Abode Services will be at the center of rolling some of these investments out. This will be an exciting time. And small improvements make huge differences. Even if ARPA is a one-time investment, there will be other resources coming, and they can have a huge impact. In 2009, the federal stimulus injected a modest $1.5 billion into the homeless funding pool, and thousands of households were housed, and homelessness immediately began to decline. It may take a long time, and a lot more resources to end homelessness, but these modest new investments over time will add up to a lot more people who can be helped. And, finally, we may not be able to help everyone today, but we can help someone every day. As anyone who works at Abode knows, this work can truly change people's lives. It is still absolutely worthwhile and critically needed. As we continue in this work, you may hear myths about homelessness come up in conversation. We're going to work through 3 common ones right now and equip you with information to help look through the myth and focus on the reality. Myth: homelessness is really about mental illness and substance use. Treatment is the answer. Reality: it is estimated that about 1/3 of people experiencing homelessness have a serious mental illness, and roughly 1/2 have substance use issues. And while both mental illness and substance use can contribute to homelessness, the relationship works in both directions. Homelessness is traumatic and can both create and worsen mental illness and substance use issues. Ensuring that people who have experienced homelessness have access to treatment is a critical tool in the toolkit, and it is part of the answer. But research has shown that without housing, people struggling with mental illness and substance use are far less likely to access and meaningfully engage in treatment because they are mostly focused on survival. There's also the other 2/3 of people without mental illness, and the half who don't have substance use issues. Treatment is clearly not the answer for them. It is important to remember that those experiencing homelessness are really diverse, with a broad set of needs and barriers to housing, but the one thing that they share is the lack of permanent, safe, affordable housing. Myth: most of those currently experiencing homelessness who sleep outside either prefer to be outdoors or are service resistant. Reality: someone who is unsheltered is typically making a difficult choice between undesirable options. As noted earlier, most of the people waiting to get into housing in the Bay Area will wait for years. Until they get to the top of the list, there may be very few options for them outside of emergency shelter. For some people, emergency shelter is not a viable option. Some shelters do not accept pets, or they require couples to separate by gender. Most require people to get rid of a lot of their belongings. There may be insufficient privacy, and the shelter may feel unsafe, especially for young people and some members of the LGBTQ+ community. Some people have experienced violence, theft of belongings, and other trauma inside shelters. And, even if it is safe, a congregate shelter can feel crowded, noisy, and otherwise intolerable for someone in crisis. In other words, if someone turns down a shelter bed, they likely have a reason, and it does not mean that they prefer to sleep outdoors. It probably means that they want housing, not shelter. It may also mean that there are no shelter beds available, which happens frequently in places like the Bay Area, where the number of people experiencing homelessness on any given night is far greater than the number of shelter beds available. It is true that people who have lived outside for a long time may take a long time to move into housing, even when a permanent housing opportunity comes up. But that does not mean that they are service resistant. It usually means that they are fearful of what it will be like once they are housed, afraid of failing, and mistrustful of a system that has not really served them well thus far. Research has shown, and Abode has shown, that most people can and will succeed in housing if given enough support and encouragement, even if it takes a few tries. Myth: most people that experienced or are currently experiencing homelessness will need intensive support for the rest of their lives. Reality: there are some people whose homelessness has been so extensive and traumatic and so medically impactful that they will likely need and/or benefit from some form of permanent supportive housing for the rest of their lives. And that is one of the powerful things about permanent supportive housing. People can stay as long as they would like. But many people experience homelessness for a relatively short period of time, after which they need very little ongoing support. Research on interventions like rapid rehousing, which provides time-limited assistance, shows that many of assisted households can move on to independent housing without experiencing homelessness again. That said, due to the chronic and substantial gap between housing costs and income for most people in rental markets like the Bay Area, most people will need ongoing financial assistance or permanently affordable housing to remain stably housed. As we come to a close, let's revisit our learning objectives from today. We built understanding of the causes of homelessness and the policies that have created the current crisis, and built empathy for those experiencing homelessness. By doing this, we continue to stay connected to Abode's mission, which is to end homelessness by assisting low-income, unhoused people, including those with special needs, to secure stable, supportive housing, and to be advocates for the removal of the causes of homelessness. Let's continue on the journey together, knowing that at Abode, we are making a difference.
Fantastic. Vivian and Joy, do you want to take over the panel discussion right now? But before I do, I just thought that the 3 myths would be a great way to start the video. And I thought that was a great way to certainly anchor it because we hear it all the time. So I'm looking forward to your panel discussion.
Great. Thanks, Dave. Can folks hear me okay? I changed speakers, so just always making sure. I appreciate it. What do y'all think? What, you stayed awake? You're still here? I don't know how many people we lost. That's always a decent sign. Yeah.
Very, very good. And I like the way it addressed the myths. I think as far as developing empathy, I have a feeling that people listening already tend to be empathetic because I think the unempathetic just kind of stick to their own sources of misinformation, but hopefully we can get them to watch something like this.
No, yeah, absolutely. And most employees that come as well are empathetic, but just, it's always good to remind ourselves.
Let me ask, do you feel empowered with the information, that you have, that if you're in a discussion or a conversation or debate, that you feel empowered from some of the information that you have, that you learned this evening? And also, was there any aha moments? There was even some aha moments for me when I watched the video before.
I took a lot of screenshots. I can crop those and use those online and social media because, yeah, I learned a lot.
Great. Thanks, Kate.
So I wanted to actually make a comment there. There was a lot of aha moments in terms, I'm really glad that you guys exist because you're on the service provider side of things. But the part of me that's a little more disheartened is that it doesn't seem like this is going to go away without some sort of like income, generation engine. I mean, we had the New Deal and basically World War II that picked us out of it. And now we're kind of, faced with this kind of changing global economy where that's, prioritizing more like tech or online stuff. So I'm just trying to figure out, I want to be very, very optimistic, and but I also want to be realistic about what really takes to completely have a systemic change.
That's a great point. I often say that we're pretty far downstream, right? So there's all the upstream things that are happening, and what I hear a lot is, gosh, what you're doing isn't working because I see more and more people on the street, so it must not be working. Well, just we are housing a ton of folks. We are, improving the lives of so many, but that doesn't mean that folks aren't still becoming homeless. So you're talking about that upstream piece. I do want to say just, I see Catherine's comment in here. Absolutely. I actually cut it off one screen too soon to the credits. And we are not only our amazing training team, but we also use a consultant who worked for Abode for 5 years. And now we work with her as a consultant, but she's a PhD from Berkeley in homeless policy. So all of the references are well cited, and we'd be happy to provide those to you. But we made it in collaboration with her, so just wanted to let you know, and I didn't give credit to all the folks that really put that together. And her name is Stacy Murphy, by the way, if you want to look her up. Annie, I see your hand up.
Yeah, just I guess question slash request before we get really underway with the panel discussion. I put it in the chat. But for some folks that may not know all the way, could you tell us a little bit more about what Abode does?
Well, I can't think of a better lead-in. Yes, so I'm wanted a little bit of talk time between because I'm going to bless you with another PowerPoint in your lives, just what you needed probably. But I'm going to tell you a little bit about Abode. I'm going to get through it really quickly because I do want to get to the discussion. But happy to share. If would that be all right with folks? So I move to PowerPoint. I see a thumbs up. I see you shaking. All right. And please jump in, Joy. You know I can talk, but I know you can. You are not shy either, so I am not gonna.
Vivian, I just wanted to make a quick comment that I've heard from people, people who are probably not as well informed, clearly, but they say, sort of if you build it, they will come sort of thing. So that they, the reason that people are attracted to California is because we have services. So I just wanted to,
Yeah, if we had a fourth myth, that would be the fourth one. Oh,
yeah.
They're coming to us.
Yeah.
That's, first of all, for Fremont, it's kind of laughable, right? People, there are a few cities like, San Francisco, Santa Cruz in the Bay Area that, maybe people do come and go more often, but people aren't coming to Fremont for homeless services. I can tell you that, and despite, the level of services we have, way back when we were doing I'll come back to this in a second. When we were doing community engagement for, I believe, Main Street Village. It's a supportive housing site in Fremont. And we had a, huge group of opposers. I love someone I see has a YIMBY on here. A lot of NIMBYs, lots of NIMBYs out there. And the police chief at the time came to the meeting and said, no, I know these folks. I went to high school with these people, right? These are people who grew up in Fremont that can't afford to live here. So, I see it over and over again. And I'll say, I love to do these sort of talks because I am more often in the room, like just on, gosh, what was it? Just last week, City Council at Newark, working on a room key site to get through. That'll be, about half serving formerly homeless. Everyone else is, low income. 2 hours of vitriol, 2 hours of residents coming up saying how awful this project was and how awful it would be to bring, any affordable housing or homeless housing to their community. So, it's 2 hours of just we have to spend more time getting the word out and educating folks that that people's properties values won't decrease, that their neighborhoods won't go to heck, that we all live in harmony. And gosh, when people live inside, it's amazing, what folks can do in terms of a wellness. So absolutely. Lots of myths out there. We only named 3. We could spend the whole video on that. All right. So really quickly, just gonna go through this. Let me see. You can see my video, right? If only I could. There you go.
Yeah, we can see your screen.
Perfect. You know our mission because we just said it. And I do have to say, I think Hayes, you mentioned this, that that we really we end homelessness for folks, but we're not as upstream, but our mission is. So our mission is really, not only to end homelessness, but really to be advocates for the removal, of the causes of homelessness. So all the things that we talked about. So a little bit about Abode, who we are. So, and this is last year, we're on a fiscal year. So what that means is July 1st to June 30th. So this is through June 30th, 2021. We served nearly 15,000 people, consisting of about 10,000 households. So of course, fewer households because we serve households with more than one member, including families. Most of the households we served, about 78%, were households with no children. So single households. There are, a lot of folks like to focus on families. Everyone deserves a home, but there are more homeless singles than anything. So our numbers really represent that. I often say that we are homeless agnostic, and that we just really believe in ending homelessness for everyone. I don't care if you're 1 day homeless, 20 years homeless, family, single, transition age youth, whatever, folks with mental health disabilities, folks with just, not enough income, everyone deserves a home. So our agency really represents that. We don't pick a favorite population. We do serve veterans as well. That number fluctuates some, but this is just sort of a sliver of who we serve. But we don't really count by numbers of served. We really look at outcomes, how we're serving people. So since our last strategic plan started, which was July 2020, we have rehoused 4,400 or almost 4,500 people. So that's unduplicated. That means if we place them into housing, 2 years ago, when they're still in housing this year, they're not counted, right? They're only counted once, from that date. And our, and Dave, you'll probably remember our last numbers was in the 12,000 that we hit in the last strategic plan period. So we're restarting that. And any given night, 6,800 folks slept in a home. So this is not including all our shelter programs, all our outreach programs, but really housing is our primary intervention. Our reach, this is where we are now. We were born here in Fremont, as an agency back in '89, but now we really, between Alameda County and Santa Clara County, we serve pretty equally. You'll see more programs in Alameda County, but more people in Santa Clara County. But that really represents a lot of folks that we serve. But we serve about 1,000 people in San Mateo as well as Napa. And then we're actually growing our programs in San Francisco and Santa Cruz right now. So it's very exciting. A little bit more about, what our growth trends. We've been, when I started 15 years ago, when we were about 40 employees, and only serving Southern Alameda County. We are actually in Livermore too, so Southern and Eastern Alameda County. That was a long time ago, but in the past 5 years, you can see this growth trajectory over time, looking at total people served, the veterans waivers, housed at any given night, and exits to permanent housing. And I can share the slideshow with you separately. So, or I know you're screenshot takers too, so feel free. And this is just, this is really for folks who didn't just see that 40-minute video, but really, everyone points to the individual causes of homelessness, and yes, there are choices we make for sure, but, you can see a large history of why people are homeless, why disproportionately people of color are homeless, and housing's expensive. So can we just stop pretending that, with a magic wand, we can put someone in housing and they can pay $2,000 or $3,000 of rent on a minimum wage job? That's not how it works. The math isn't there, right? Even on a living minimum wage, it just can't happen. So let's actually look at our systems, look at the structural factors. And yeah, there's some individual stuff there too, but, really largely this is a history of, a history that's come along to make this where we're at now. A little bit about how Abode ends homelessness. I probably should have put this in the front, but we really have 4 primary business areas. We have housing development. So we build housing from the ground up. We have about 15 projects in development through 7 Bay Area counties, actually. And even that's a little frustrating. I'm sure you know the Fremont narrative of those those greedy developers, right? And we get thrown in there just like everyone else. Let me tell you, the developing permanent supportive housing is not for the faint of heart, and we're not making money off of this. Okay, despite what everyone around you says, it is incredibly difficult and takes at least 5 years from inception to when people move in. and that's honestly when developers get paid at that 5-year mark. So, it's an interesting cycle and stigma around development. We have a property management company as well. That's the smallest, but actually fastest growing division in our agency, because it's not only the building, it's actually what you do inside that building and providing services, providing the property management, in that building is different for supportive housing. In a regular complex, if someone doesn't pay rent, you might put a red, pay or quit notice on their door. We don't do that in supportive housing. That might trigger someone with lots of other challenges in their lives. We would, approach them in a different way. We would reach out to services, to ensure that they have the help that they need to access. So those are the two sort of bricks and mortar sides of the agency. The two services side of the agency are housing services. That's all of our work with the landlords. We work with over 1,100 landlords in the Bay Area market, helping to secure rental units for folks and lots of different programs, over 60 different programs where we buy down the rent. It could be a short-term program called rapid rehousing, meaning we might pay for a month to 2 years, or it could be a long-term permanent supportive housing in a scattered site model. So permanent supportive housing can be in a building like City Center or Main Street Village or Laguna Commons, or it can be an apartment that you and I live in, just renting a unit and providing folks support in going to their home to meet with them. So the housing services really speaks to, I think we administer about $40 million worth of subsidies each year, and work with 1,100 landlords. And we have about 50 or 60 staff that just do that. The whole job is to cultivate and support landlords or property managers, etc. And then the biggest portion of our work is really housing focused social services. So that's providing support from soup to nuts, outreach to shelter, to support in all of those other housing interventions. So in the bricks and mortar and the site base, or in the scattered site approach, short term or long term. So really the full gamut of services. And it really depends on the program. We have really light touch of like, hey, let me help get you housed. And then, I know you got this, like you have a better job, you have, you have help for mom, and I'll back off to really intensive full scope services with help of mental health case managers and psychiatry and the whole bit. So really it depends on the program and the level of need. Low income housing, I don't think I have to tell you this, but it's not all the same. I think low income housing can, and this is where Dave is, far more about the policy side of this, but low income housing technically can qualify for anything up to 110 or 120% of area median income. Our people can't afford that. Our people can't even afford 30% area median income. So really, I ask you to listen to we need housing for everyone, period. We need low income housing, period. But a lot of low income housing isn't really going to meet the need of homelessness because, people have to pay a rent that is far beyond what they have to pay. So these are things that I ask when a developer comes to me and says, hey, you want a partner? Or we're looking at a site, what can residents pay? What are the local priorities? Can we have beautiful open space? Because, like just cramming a lot of people into one space with, that's not beautiful. That's not the right thing. Race equity, definitely. How can we make a difference? Amenities, what type of housing, density, size of units, and, mixed income. I'll be honest with you, from an Abode perspective, we prefer mixed communities. So meaning we prefer, about half of the units dedicated to folks who had experienced homelessness and the other half for various ranges of low income. We just think that actually builds super strong and vibrant communities over time. And it just creates, stability for the building and everyone in it. But we can debate a lot about that because we even debate internally. And then at the end of the day, really you know, when we're building things, and again, or like looking into a program or doing anything, you know, we always have to, you know, remember who we're building it for, either program or the site. You know, we have to remember the voices of all those people that we don't serve yet, right? That aren't in that housing. So I often tell all of my staff, you know, that look, we actually have programs and we serve, but we have to be looking at not only those that are through our doors now, but those that can't get through our doors. All so we really consider any person that's homeless, you know, like we need to figure out how to get to them faster. It's a huge, you know, problem. Race, equity, inclusion, we want to build in all of our neighborhoods. You know, we want to make sure that everything's sustainable. Density matters and quality matters. And again, this is an area that we can probably go to town on, but bending the cost and time curve, we hear a lot about that. You know, you hear just a lot of jargon out there, but it can't mean building substandard housing for people who are homeless. We did that actually. We didn't talk about it in the history, but you know, the old projects that, you know, back in the day that were ugly, just boxes, they were intentionally built that way. They were intentionally built to be substandard because the idea is, you know, well, people wouldn't have anything to look up to if they, you know, if we gave them everything they needed now. And we all know how that ended up, right? Those ghettos, you know, didn't create strong, vibrant communities. They created, you know, awful places to live with substandard housing. So that is, I think that's it. So thank you. And I can send, or you have all my contact information. I'm happy to talk about any of this anymore, but that's the short who we are at Abode.
Okay, is this the time for the Q&A, Vivian?
Please.
Okay, wonderful. I'm going to ask a question. We have a representative from the AC Transit Board, Diane Shaw, that asked a question about the film that we watched. Now, that was a very good question, where they were saying, you know, what happened to all the single residency occupancies? Why did they disappear in our urban centers? And I don't think the movie directly addressed that, but if you know, I have a theory, but go ahead, Vivian or Joy, and if you want to respond to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and I don't know, I can go back and get you better answers, but it's always in the name of revitalization and gentrification of like, hey, you know, how do we make this, how do we attract the right type of folks, right? So I think that, you know, communities are often looking at that, and I say the right type. So a lot of this naturally affordable housing is really deemed as inferior, right? And I think I saw other comments in the chat earlier, like, you know, higher end housing is, you know, is often deemed more desirable. So folks want to build that. Catherine, you also sent a reference to a personal chat as well. Were you answering that question as well? So, and Catherine, did we introduce you?
No, that's totally
Hi,
fine. I support the Abode's executive team, so just here for admin support. And I did find an article, I just haven't had a chance to go through it. It was a New York Times Magazine article that I could look at more closely and potentially send that to David to share.
Thank you.
I just don't know if it specifically answered the question about what happened to all that housing between 1990 and 2002.
Well, one of the things certainly is that the aging of the inventory itself is an issue which the movie did address, where you went from $45 billion a year of loss of affordable housing to maybe now $2 billion a year trying to make up for it. And we have a much larger population to address, so that there's a huge gap there. That was one issue for me. Vivian, a question about the moratorium in Alameda County. You talked about rapid rehousing. Right now, the county has stood out as freezing the ability to remove tenants for non-payment of rent. Do you find that that's having an impact in people that have been dislocated trying to find housing when you're working with landlords in Alameda County, or do you not find a cause and effect on that yet?
No, honestly, we haven't really found that. I mean, just rental rental housing in the Bay Area has always been really tough. So a lot of people there has been a wave of people moving out, those who can, so higher income earners. So there's been some naturally occurring vacancy, at least earlier on the pandemic. It's stopped over the past 6 to 8 months. So the market is certainly tightening. We're actually more concerned about when the moratoriums end, not only for all of those who might get displaced, right? That we will potentially be our next participants in our programs, but also for our relationship with our landlords. We don't want to inadvertently displace people. So as we are, like I said, we are cultivating landlords, right? We don't want to by any way encourage them to evict someone because they know that we can refill a unit. So we're being thoughtful about how we don't become part of a problem, right? That we don't take advantage actually of the wave to come, because I can tell you we have hundreds of people to house right this second on all of our caseloads, right? So if there were hundreds of units to become available tomorrow, we could help fill them, right? But we would want to make sure that it was done in a way that was consistent with our values.
Hayes, thank you for leading by doing this right. I hope everybody else that wants to have a question populates our chat bar. Hayes's question is, what in your view is the most effective way or ways that local advocates can help to end homelessness? What is the best role Fremont for Everyone can perform in that effort?
Mobilization, I think, for any sort of housing project that would support it, which is what you're doing. Oftentimes, and I should also note, and Joy, please, jump in, but the participant that was joining us had to jump off because her internet was spotty. We don't ask a lot of participants of our programs to come and speak, because first of all, that, we're just careful not to even consider being coercive in any way. Like, we don't want to create an atmosphere in which, like, hey, we served you, so do this for us. We want to make sure that we serve them because that's what we do, right? We expect nothing in return. So it's just hard to so no one hears the voices of those unhoused frequently. So if you could have their voice, I think to the extent that you can speak as a neighbor, because I just can't tell you how many times I've gotten cussed out or just because I'm an interested party. If I'm bringing something, right, you're not an interested party. You are, and I say interested party, but you're not gaining anything from this. You are just speaking as a local citizen. So being out there, with talking points is huge. Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, I think that the Mythbusters element of your video is something that we should all have as talking points wherever we go when we meet with people. Some of the other questions that we're having from the chat is when we had a slide on the racial classifications of our unhoused population. Is that reflected the numbers? I think it was 47% of African Americans are among the unhoused population in the county, although it's only 11% of the total population. How does our local unhoused population reflect these racial disparities?
So in Alameda County, there's a huge range, right? So Oakland and Fremont look a lot different, right? So, and unfortunately, we haven't had a homeless count in a few years to really drill down. I would say that, that people of color are still disproportionately represented in Fremont, but probably not as largely as a place like Oakland, because there's just a huge racial difference in the makeup. Populations that are underrepresented typically, that we're beginning to see some creep, are Asian, both, Chinese, Indo-American. We're not seeing, we don't see that level of homelessness commensurate with the communities that we're in. That's a huge one. And Latinx, it really ranges. In Santa Clara County, there's a higher disproportionality than in Alameda County. So it ranges. So we're
But
looking at all of
these, the distinctions between Oakland and this area also goes to the other element of the earlier point that you made, that we're not a magnet for services in Fremont.
Right.
In our RV population that we have, 70% were living as residents in permanent housing before they were in their RVs. So they are our neighbors. And I think we need to have that sense that this is our community issue. It's not somebody else's issue that we're inheriting.
And I can say, because we serve people everywhere, we house far more people from Fremont and Oakland than vice versa. Right? So people are like, are you housing our Oakland people? And like, no, like there's no, like there's so little, here that, and it's always a problem because people from Fremont, we're always looking for housing in Fremont, and there's just not a lot of it. So we're trying to convince people like, okay, well, I don't have anything here. Will you take this? How about Hayward? How about San Leandro? Right? So there's this idea of like, no, we're not bringing more people into it. It's sort of silly.
I don't know if you want to answer this truthfully, but this is a great question. It says, which county or city do you find has been easier to work with and the impact more noticeable?
Oh, you're trying to get me in trouble.
Not my question.
Each county is unique. I'd say that Santa Clara County has invested far more resources in housing. So they have a newer sort of housing system, but they, passed a $950 million bond, of which almost all of it went to actual homeless housing. I think Alameda County had $580 million bond, of which 20% of 80% went to sort of homeless, right? So it gives you an idea. Having said that, Alameda County has done a really great job in the pandemic era of really making sure that people who are homeless get cared for in the best possible way, really using the full scale of their medical systems to keep homeless safe, right? So it just really depends. That they excel in different things. So there's definitely more of a medical lens, I'd say, in Alameda County, which is, help keep people safe, and more of a building lens in Santa Clara County. Joy, now that I've gotten myself into trouble, what do you think? You're making me sweat, people.
Well, looking at our impact study, we're our greatest impact that we make, and I think the impact also, because the systems may flow, is Alameda. But we have great partners in Santa Clara County, which is one of the counties that I oversee. Still great partners. It may be a little bit more, we may not have the same housing stock. There may be other things that kind of impede our ability to house folks. But I would agree, actually, that Alameda would probably be there with others to follow. Let me put it that way. But again, I think even all of our counties, there's just different nuances that may impede our ability to have greater impact.
The reason I just asked that also was to find some of the low-hanging fruit that you want to discuss with people to kind of get them motivated.
Yeah, I mean, the other place where you could be helpful is, sort of if you own property or know people who own property, like, always looking, for landlord partners. This is not necessarily altruistic, like we pay full rent and security deposit and, plus some usually, right? So it's a business relationship for sure. But that's certainly another area. We have the hardest time there, frankly, in Napa and Santa Cruz. So because there's just so little housing stock in both those communities that it's being decimated by fires and whatnot year over year. So so housing stock is a huge issue. In Alameda and Santa Clara, at least we have some big cities in there that have some housing stock. San Mateo is a little bit in between.
Yeah, Annie had a good question. They asked, concerning the scattered site model that you mentioned earlier, how do you vet landlords to make sure that they don't act unscrupulously, that they take abode funds and then treat their tenants badly? What is the
Yeah, well, most of
develop
our
these relationships?
in our programs, we have both a service person connected to the tenant, right? And then we have a person connected to the landlord that we're constantly checking in and frankly comparing notes. We also, I probably shouldn't say this to some, folks who have been part of Abode from a board perspective, but 15 years ago, like literally everyone had different spreadsheets and, and there were times in which, we had 3 or 4 Abode people actually trying to get the same unit and actually, driving up the price. Oh, I'll pay this. No, I'll pay that. I'll pay that. And it was bad. I'll just say that. Many years ago, I think we're up to 9 or 10, we went to a Salesforce platform that we actually manage all of our landlords in. And I say this because we also put notes on our landlords, like, do not use, so we have some blacklisted landlords that have not treated either our staff or the residents how we expect them to be treated. So, and then, we always try to work with a landlord first because we work with a lot of mom and pops. They don't know. So they might say something that shows some racial bias and we might say something back like, I want to let you know if, that's not legal. And I'm trying to keep you out of trouble here. Never say that or do that again. That's not okay. Right. So we don't like call the ACLU or we don't like report them immediately. Like we say, hey, let me help you be a good landlord. Right. And then if the behavior continues, then we'll move people, or report them if necessary at the extreme. Because there are a few.
Do you want to describe your experience during COVID with Project Home Key, working with Alameda County, and what that experience has been like, and moving forward, how do you see that as a model for dealing with the increase in homelessness?
Yeah, I mean, it's been a privilege and a real passion and just some hard work. I get to talk to folks like you, politicians, bureaucrats, but really the people, Joy and her teams really get to work actually to on the ground with folks. So when we started the pandemic, we had about 440 staff, and 6 months in, we were already past 520. Now we're at 640.
Wow.
Right. So we've grown tremendously, and that's largely because there's been a call to action to get as many people inside and safe as possible, and to house them once they are inside. So we've housed over, I think, 800 folks from those hotels already, right? And we'll still have more to go. We also run the isolation quarantine sites in Alameda County. And I have some guilt. Like this weekend, like I went to Half Moon Bay with my kids, and we've had 600 referrals into those isolation quarantine sites, COVID positive individuals who are experiencing homelessness. They could be in a congregate shelter setting, or they could be in an encampment that need to come inside and be watched so that, to make sure their symptoms don't get worse where they have to be hospitalized. But, so we've put, the staff are working, have been working those sites. We were called by the state of California mid-February, like 4 or 5 days into the shelter in place. Mid-March in 2020, saying, hey, we have these 2 sites, the Radisson and the Comfort Inn in Oakland, can you run them? Before there was any masks, before we knew anything about anything, and we said yes. It took a big gulp, and we hired about 50 people, in a week, and opened up the hotel within a week and started getting people inside. So the massive outbreaks that San Francisco was seeing, we stopped at the gate before it actually got there. So, we served almost 5,000 people alone last year. And it's not only Alameda County, Santa Clara County served just as many people in the hotels. in a slightly different way, but you know, we've our staff have just been rocketed and they're tired. Everyone's so tired. But yeah, no, so we I think we've operated over 15 sites, new sites, as part of room key isolation quarantine hotels in 3 different counties: Napa, Santa Clara, and Alameda. Joy, did you want to add anything? Your team's been in the thick of that.
Yeah, and still going strong, which is unbelievable to be able to kind of stand in the midst of that. But it's, you know, who would have known that the pandemic and the direct link to housing and those who are unhoused? I think that was what was interesting. But we have been out in the forefront, kept those our buildings staffed. So very proud of our team and our staff. The one thing I do want to add to someone who asked us earlier, we talked about it because I think these are opportunities where you increase your knowledge, but and thank you so much for participating in this, but now you to be able to impact representatives, to be able to impact your communities, to, as Vivian said, landlords, and I even say even at your dinner table, you know, of how the unhoused are seen in a community. And I think those conversations even happen at our dinner tables. I felt the same way around race when the George Floyd event occurred. And so those are the ways that you can can help Abode in the work that we do and in partnership with us, but also here in Fremont.
Fantastic. Well,
David,
we had.
Diane, can I just make a comment to what Joy just said? And I one of the other things I'll say is, because I know Vivian talked about the 2-hour thing they had the other night when they did the home key in Newark, and I was part of that 2 hours, or at least I was on the other end of the call, is I really think that this group can help to provide more input there to try to help to educate those people that are on the call that are making some really horrendous comments that they really don't know what they're talking about. They really need to be educated. And I think the more that we can show support and bring people out in a positive light with those conversations in front of city council or wherever it might be, it not only will help to educate people, but I think it helps. I've been on the receiving end of those comments, as you probably have as well, and it's really hard. You get really down on it. And so just to have a few positive comments in between, I think help you go for the next 2 hours when you're hearing all this negativity. So I really think that that's a place that all of us can kind of help, and it doesn't take a lot of time or effort to do that.
Yeah, totally agree, Diane.
Absolutely.
One of the things that we did as advocacy group, was mentioned earlier, was mobilize around the HNC in Fremont. What we could do now, 2 years into the program, is take each of the arguments that were raised by people that were opposed to the HNC and say, now we have 2 years of data points. No, we're not seeing people congregate around City Hall seeking services, knocking on the door, trying to be in the program. No, we haven't seen an upsurge of mental illness and drug abuse, loitering in the area. All of the arguments that were raised were really, you know, at one level, some people may believe them. At another level, it's about just trying to, in some communities, not even have the specter of homelessness be acknowledged because it's somehow a stigma. So all of the arguments flow from that initial prejudice. So at some level, it's some people we need to reach, but we need to just keep having the conversation going. And we need to be there supporting elected officials, saying, you know, if you're in a room, I've been on the other side of the dais, if you're in a room, you have a few good articulate advocates and you're on the fence. I was never on the fence, but if you're on the fence, but you hear something else, then you don't bow to public pressure in the chambers. And so I think we can never underestimate our own ability to email our elected officials and city staff and support them in their efforts in doing the right thing. It is now already 7:40. We had a few minutes before we started, but we said we were going to go from 6 to 7:30. So I think I want to thank everyone for attending. And if there's any, and again, the wonderful team here at Fremont for Everyone, I just happen to be the public face for good or for ill, talking as the MC. but we had some terrific effort from our entire leadership team in collaboration with Catherine over at Abode, Catherine Reese and Vivian and Joy. Pleasure meeting you. Vivian and Joy, I'll just give it to you briefly. Did you want to wrap up with any final comments before we say goodnight?
You want to start, Joy?
Yeah, I just want to again thank you for this coming together. I wasn't really sure what this would be, but I love the conversation. I agree with Vivian. This is actually refreshing because I was on a call not too long ago with community, and it's like you hear all the things. It's just like crushing as a person who works and does this work, and also and a person of color who sees the need great in our community. So I'm glad you're here, that you have the information. We're always available. We provided the link to the film plus the PowerPoint. So you have that information to go forward with, and you just press, and we'll do it again soon. Thank you. Vivian?
Yeah, I mean, the same to me. It's a pleasure. Again, I am a Fremont resident. My kids go to school here in Fremont, one at Mission, one at Azaveda. And so I care deeply about this community. It's not just my job. Like there are easier jobs to have. I can guarantee it. So please, reach out to me. I think I definitely gave my information. Catherine will keep me honest. I am pretty scheduled, but she'll make sure that I get back to folks, quickly. So I'm very fortunate to have that support. But just a real pleasure, and God, thank you so much, not only for having us, but for just caring about this and being advocates for housing and people who are unhoused in our community. So just a million thank yous.
Very good. Have a nice evening on this Martin Luther King Day, who did talk about not only racial equality, but economic equality. So this is an economic justice. So this is perfectly timed. Thank you.
Hayes, did you have a comment?
Oh yeah, actually one more thing, quick announcement. I know another way that we as advocates can help too. I want to do a quick plug. Abode Service, they do take donations for their work to support their ongoing mission. I know that the Journey Home breakfast is coming up soon. Is that correct? Is that happening this year?
Yep, it's coming up. I think the first Friday in March, and that always comes to mind, but I always hate asking for donations, but thank you for asking.
Yeah, so that's why I'm here to ask on your behalf. And so I personally, just as I always dedicate my personal budget, and there's no conflict here because I'm not getting a cut from them, but they just happen to be the local service provider that I think has done the most. So I participate in this breakfast, and I urge that if you guys have our means or in a position to do so, consider if you want to make systemic changes to do it in that way as well. So
and the website is abodeservices.org/donate, and you can make a 501c3 charitable donation.
Thanks for that. Well, I can't think of a better way to end.
Bye-bye.
Bye, guys.
Thanks, everyone.